Welcome, everybody, to On This Day on the Early True Sports Network. And as always, On This Day is brought to you by and powered by Betting.net. Betting.net is your best bet for finding the online sportsbook casino that's right for you. Make sure you check them out at Betting.net. All right, guys, I am your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpaster. Of course, you're watching the Early True Sports Network. Make sure you check out SI Sportsbook, which is our top recommended sportsbook for betting on the games. You can check that in the link in the description down below. But let's go ahead and let's get to our show today. And we are going to basically start off here. We're going to watch a little Ray Manicini versus Livingstone Bramble, which was a fight nobody thought would really be a competitive fight. And the reason we say that is, Ray Mancini was, for lack of a better term, one of boxing's golden boys back in the day. And when we look at boxing's golden boy, we're picking this up, I think, about halfway through the fight. But Ray Mancini was a dude who basically caught on with CBS Sports. He had the great stories from Youngstown, Ohio. His dad, Lenny, had been the number one contender for the lightweight championship, but never got the fight for it because of the war. He was the number one contender in 1941, 1942. Now, Ray Boo Boo Mancini's career starts off, he beats Johnny Summerhays, who was a solid journeyman fighter. Then he beats Norman Goins at Felt Forum in New York City. But then his career really took off. He beat Jorge Morales. That was, I believe, I think it was on an undercard of maybe an NBC fight where you got to see how good he was. And then he fought Jose Luis Ramirez, the old vulnerable veteran who was a very good fighter. And Mancini dominated Ramirez, winning the fight 120 to 108, 119, 110, and 119, 112 on the three judges scorecard. Now, a little bit later, though, he fights Alexis Arguello for the championship. And when you're talking about Alexis Arguello, you're talking about a whole different level of fighter. Arguello, one of the greatest lightweights of all time, one of the greatest junior lightweights of all time. Featherweight, Alexis Arguello was a stud. He was coming off winning title over Jim Watt, who he dominated. He was known as the Thin Man. He was explosive, and he basically beat Mancini. Now, the thing that struck us, though, was you had Lenny sitting, ringside. You had Ray giving the fight of his life against Alexis Arguello. And then you had the gracious Arguello after the fight going down, really cared about Mancini and his family, it seemed like. So really, this is a loss that probably blew Mancini's career up more than ever. After that, he goes on and he beats Julio Valdez, just a journeyman fighter, but he gets a shot against Arturo Frias. Arturo Frias, tough dude from out of California. He stopped Frias at about a minute and a half, but it was a great minute and a half, similar to Hagler Hearns. Then he beats Ernesto Espana, who everybody had to beat because Espana was legitimately for 5 years the number one contender, no matter what he did with the WBA. But he stops in a high school football stadium. Mancini stops him in the sixth round. Now, we're going to go ahead and fast forward here. Nobody wants to watch the in-between rounds. But when we look at this now, which is Livingstone Bramble. The big thing leading up to this fight with Mancini was you had the Dooku Kim tragedy, where Kim passed away at the end of the 13th round when the fight was stopped with 19 seconds left in a loot war. That seemed to affect him. 3 months later, he fought George Feeney, who was just a journeyman. He stops Feeney. He has trouble with Orlando Romero. He stops and beats up Bobby Chacon. The issue with Chacon was should have never been fighting at that weight. When we look at Livingstone Bramble, his probably career best wins leading up to this fight were against James Bubba Bashimi, who he won a majority decision over. He stopped Teddy Hatfield. He won a unanimous decision against Gaetan Hart, who had gotten stopped for the title in 6 rounds by Gaetan Hart a year before. And then he beat Raphael Williams, who was a good contender. He stopped him by a unanimous decision. When we come into this fight, everybody expect that this is just kind of like the Romero fight, where Mancini's going to come in, he's going to dominate the fight, he's going to win it, and that's going to set up a fall showdown against Hector Macho Camacho, who was undefeated at the time, or a fight against Aaron Pryor, who was also undefeated at the time. Now, Pryor versus Mancini would have been huge because you'd had Cincinnati versus Youngstown, Ohio. Would have been an enormous fight. Mancini and Camacho would have been too, but Pryor Mancini would have been huge. And it was a fight that seemed close to being made until Livingstone Bramble showed up. Now, this fight, I mean, it was a tremendous fight. The rematch was a tremendous fight. But when you look at these guys, the thing I remember about Mancini, and I watched this fight, I think, the day after it happened. It happened, I believe, on a Friday night. The fight was shown by, I think, Cat Sports in Cincinnati and like Saturday. So I didn't even know who won the fight, and I'm watching the fight. And at the end, all you remember is seeing a helpless Ray Manicini with his hands to his side, his eyes nearly closed, seemingly looking for help. But not even the big heart of the judges' benevolent scoring could have given Ray Mancini this fight. Livingstone Bramble, who raised pit bulls, fought like one and scored a dramatic 14th round knockout of Mancini to win the WBA lightweight championship. There were 14,500 stunned spectators at the Buffalo Memorial Auditorium who had already seen a 4-1 underdog, Gene Mad Dog Hatcher, capture the WBA junior welterweight title with a dramatic, shocking 11th round stoppage over Johnny Bump City Bumpus. That was in the 11th round. Now we had referee Marty Dinkin watch Bramble land about 24 unanswered punches to the champion's head. Then he stopped about at 53 seconds of the round. Mancini was on his feet throughout, but collapsed at his quarter afterwards and was taken to Milford Fillmore Hospital for x-rays of his nose and jaw and patchwork around his eyes, which were cut, as per usual of Mancini. But even at the end, his manager Dave Wolf slowly climbing the stairs, and with one of the ringside physicians, Dr. Armand Sanaka, about to rush into the ring, Mancini tried to punch back. Mancini, who had become one of boxing's biggest stars, suffered only his second loss in 31 fights, the first, of course, to Arguello. He sent Wolf to the post-fight press conference where the manager, his voice breaking, almost in tears, occasionally said, the first thing he was pushing me to do was to make the rematch. One thing he wanted to make very sure though, was that the better man had won the night. Now, the 23-year-old Mancini was terribly beaten man. Even though two of the judges assigned by, of course, the WBA did not think so. Lou Moret and Stanley Berg had Mancini ahead by 124 and shockingly 125-122. Only judge Mike Galena had Bramble ahead. His score was dead on, 126-121 on the 10-point scoring system. Bramble, who had said he had a coconut head, it was never hurt by the perpetual motion Mancini, did not dispute the scoring. Bramble said he was the champion and he threw more punches. I thought I was landing the better, cleaner, more effective punches, though. Quickly, Mancini knew he was in for a fight because Bramble, who was often wild with his words, was not wild in the ring. He was calm, cool, collected. He kept his arms in tight. It was hard to get to his body. And basically, the morning of the fight, Bramble's words threatened Mancini. He threatened to bite Mancini's left ear off. And he calmly and coolly picked apart Mancini in this fight. He did not need help from his voodoo doctor, who he called Dr. Do, and who he revealed after the fight was just his basketball coach for 13 years back in the native Virgin Islands. Now, Mancini suffered a bad cut, per usual, on his right eyelid in the first round, apparently from a solid left hook. But Dinkin ruled the cut was caused by a headbutt. It seems like everything worked against Bramble going into this fight. Bramble was 23 years old. He entered the fight with a 21-1 record and a WBA #1 rating. Probably shouldn't have been #1. But I think, once again, they're trying to set up a big money fight for Mancini. There's no reason to put him at risk against a guy who can really fight. Unfortunately, they did not realize Livingstone Bramble could fight. And he used his he didn't really even use his 9-inch reach advantage. He instead beat Mancini at the championship game inside. As we talked about, Bramble's arms, he had the long arms, elbows tucked in tight. Mancini's body blows never got there. Now, he slipped naturally from his orthodox stance to southpaw he was actually he was a great fighter on this night. And he cut Mancini's nose in the 6th round and opened a gash over his left eye in the 9th. Mancini had trouble breathing because of the blood in his mouth. And by the 10th round, both eyes were closing and Mancini's punches were weakened. Now, Bramble said after the fight that Ray was punching soft from about the 8th round on. He said, then I'd see his legs buckle when I didn't even hit him hard. I knew I had him. The battering started in the 7th. A right hand buckled the champion's right knee that round. And only Mancini's great condition and great fighting heart kept him upright through the following rounds. In the 8th, Bramble was loading up on his punches and repeatedly wobbling Mancini. The champion was forced to hold on after a left lead. From a southpaw stance, a left lead. Now, he wobbled him backwards. Bramble retained the advantage throughout the 9th and 10th. But in the 11th, Bramble, for some reason, stopped throwing punches. And Mancini gradually worked his way back into the fight. His punches did not hurt Bramble, except for on the scorecards. Now, the challenger who came to this country exactly 5 years ago from that night, February the 16th, 1984, he settled into Passaic, New Jersey. He resumed his attack in the 13th round, and by round's end had Mancini wobbled again. The end was clear for now. One of boxing's major attractions was an ex-champion, and at least 2 men in the crowd that night, Hector Macho Camacho and Aaron Pryor, would go home disappointed as their multi-million-dollar paydays disappeared. Now, when we look at the careers of these two fighters, the thing really interests me a lot when I talk about them, aftermath of this fight. There was a rematch fought in Lake Tahoe or Reno, I think, a year later. And it was an even better fight than this. It was a closer fight than this, probably a point or two's all that separated the two fighters. And, Mancini came up short. I think it was 143, 142, 143, 142, and 144 to 141 for Livingstone Bramble. And that was basically it for Boom Boom Mancini after that. I mean, he retired for a few years. He came back and he fought Hector Macho Camacho, I think around 1987, like 3-4 years after this fight. And Camacho won a close, disputed decision. I mean, not a whole lot was done on either side. Both guys were past their prime, but Camacho was much closer to his prime than Mancini was. I think the fight might have been 1980. Yeah, I think it was right around 87 or so. And then a few years after that, Mancini fought Greg Haugen. And Greg Haugen was a guy who was a solid fighter. Of course, most noteworthy with Haugen was probably the 3 fights with Vinny Pazienza. And then the fights at the end of his career with Julio Cesar Chavez in front of over 100,000 people. But Haugen dominated Mancini, stopped him in the 6th or 7th round. That was pretty much it for Boom Boom. Bramble, on the other hand, his issue was when you look at his career record after he retired, you'll see a guy, and you'll think he's a journeyman. He was 40, 26, and 3. But Bramble, after his upset of Mancini, the look he fought was ridiculous. I mean, after the Mancini fight, he beat Tyrone Butterfly Crawley to defend the title he'd won from Mancini. And everything went fine. He beats Crawley, but then he fights Edwin Rosario. This was in November or September 26th, I believe, in 1986. He fights Edwin Rosario. Rosario stops him in the 2nd round, dominating performance. After that, you get a draw and a loss to Freddie Pendleton. You get a win over Harold Brazier, which is a good win. He loses to Santos Cardona for the NABF title. But then once you get to 1992, there are so many losses here. It's ridiculous. And really, he probably lost 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I mean, he's 40 and 26, and probably 24 of those losses came in the last, quarter of his career. So he was never the same there. But make no mistake, Livingstone Bramble was a badass, and he beat Ray Manicini when nobody thought he could beat Ray Manicini. And the great thing about Livingstone Bramble is I was a huge Ray Mancini fan. I'm from Indiana, but the border of Indiana, Ohio. Ray Mancini was the hot thing. And I remember all the stuff Bramble said to Mancini before those 2 fights, during those 2 fights, and I hated Livingstone Bramble. But when I started doing the Legends of Boxing show back around 2018, I had the pleasure of interviewing Livingstone Bramble. I went into it with preconceived notions that this guy's an asshole because of the way he talked to Mancini. But after interviewing Bramble for an hour, I came away thinking this is a really good dude. He explained on there how it was just to sell the fight, how to make Mancini think he was nuts, to try to get Mancini out of his mind to fight him. And in that first fight, he did it because Mancini was so thrown off by that. He could barely fight correctly. The second fight, Mancini fought his fight. He fought as well as he could fight, and Livingstone Bramble still beat him. So on this day, February 16, 1984, Livingstone Bramble upsets Ray Manicini in their first fight, in a great fight at the War Memorial in Buffalo. And I still remember it was Gene Mad Dog Hatcher setting the tone when he stopped Johnny Bump City Bumpus with a hellacious 11th round knockout that nobody saw coming. And I remember the announcers saying before the Bramble Mancini fight, you never know what can happen because you're now at the Cats Sports Night of upsets. And that's what this was, February 16th of 1984. All right, guys, make sure you follow me at Grueling Truth on Twitter. Like, subscribe, hit the bell notification for YouTube. Make sure you follow along here. Go like and follow us on the Grueling Truth Facebook page. We've got over 150,000 followers there, 72,000 on YouTube, 25,000 on Twitter. Make sure you follow us everywhere you can. And make sure you watch our weekly NFL show and our weekly Indiana basketball show. But for now, I'm Mike Goodpaster for On This Day. We'll catch you tomorrow when it'll be On This Day all over again, February the 17th. I bet you can't wait to see what February the 17th brings for On This Day. But for now, for the Grueling Truth, I'm Mike Goodpaster. You've been watching and listening to the Grueling Truth.